The silence at Kandahar airfield was broken only by the distant hum of generators and the occasional crackle of radio static. It was 3:47 hours when the encrypted transmission came through, urgent and fragmented. Bird down, coordinates unclear, single survivor. The voice belonged to Captain Mitchell Reynolds, whose Blackhawk had vanished into the Hindu Kush Mountains 72 hours earlier. Intelligence suggested the Taliban had anti-aircraft capabilities in the region, but no one expected what happened next. Major Valentina Ghost Kozlov stood in the briefing room, her weathered flight suit bearing the faded patches of 3 combat deployments. The other pilots exchanged glances, the kind that spoke volumes about their doubts. At 34, Ghost had logged more combat hours than most of her male counterparts, but in their eyes, she remained the outsider, the anomaly in a world of testosterone and tradition. Her pale blue eyes, cold as the Siberian winters of her childhood, scanned the satellite imagery spread across the aluminum table. "Ma'am, with respect," Lieutenant Colonel Barnes began, his Texas drawl thick with condescension, "this is a high-risk extraction in Taliban-controlled territory. Maybe we should consider sending Razor or Gunslinger for this one." The other pilots nodded in agreement, their confidence bolstered by years of fraternal validation. Ghost's fingers traced the flight path on the map, calculating wind patterns, elevation changes, and potential ambush points with the precision of a surgeon. She had earned her call sign not through bravado or reckless flying, but through an almost supernatural ability to appear and disappear in hostile airspace without detection. Her Apache helicopter had become legend among ground troops, a phantom in the sky that materialized when hope seemed lost. The mystery deepened when reconnaissance drones revealed something impossible: Reynolds' Blackhawk intact in a valley that should have been crawling with enemy fighters. No heat signatures, no movement, just an American helicopter sitting in Taliban territory like a chess piece waiting for the next move. The implications were staggering. Either this was the most elaborate trap ever conceived, or something had happened in those mountains that defied conventional warfare. As Ghost studied the intelligence reports, she noticed something others had missed. The crash site wasn't random. It was positioned exactly where her brother's helicopter had gone down 3 years earlier during Operation Enduring Resolve. The coordinates matched to the meter. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly, a tell that only the most observant would catch. This wasn't just another rescue mission. This was personal. The briefing room fell silent as she finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of countless missions and buried grief. "I'll bring him home." It wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a promise forged in the crucible of loss and tempered by unwavering determination. Ghost's childhood in post-Soviet Russia had taught her that survival often depended on being underestimated. Her father, a decorated Spetsnaz veteran, had drilled into her the importance of silence, patience, and precision. "The ghost that haunts the battlefield," he would say, "is not the one who makes the most noise, but the one who strikes without warning and vanishes without trace." These words had guided her through flight school at Embry-Riddle, where she graduated summa cum laude despite facing skepticism from instructors who questioned whether women belonged in combat aviation. Her first deployment to Afghanistan had been brutal. The Taliban had shot down 2 American helicopters in her first month, and the pressure to prove herself was suffocating. Male pilots whispered that she was a liability, a political correctness experiment that would get people killed. But Ghost had something they didn't understand, a connection to the aircraft that transcended mechanical operation. She could feel the Apache's vibrations, hear subtle changes in engine pitch, and sense atmospheric conditions that others missed entirely. The transformation began during a night mission near Helmand Province. A Marine patrol was pinned down by heavy Taliban fire, taking casualties with each passing minute. 3 male pilots had attempted the rescue, forced to abort due to intense ground fire and poor visibility. Command was preparing to write off the Marines when Ghost volunteered for the mission. Flying through a sandstorm at zero visibility, guided only by instruments and intuition, she had navigated the Apache through a canyon system that military maps deemed impassable. Her precision strikes eliminated 12 Taliban positions without a single friendly fire incident. When she extracted the wounded Marines, one bloodied sergeant looked up at her and whispered, "You're not human. You're a damn ghost." The call sign stuck, but more importantly, respect began to replace ridicule. Years of combat had refined Ghost's skills to an almost supernatural level. She could identify aircraft by engine sound alone, predict weather patterns hours before meteorologists, and execute maneuvers that defied conventional flight physics. Her Apache, tail number 50347, had been modified with her personal touches, enhanced targeting systems, upgraded defensive countermeasures, and a small Russian Orthodox cross welded discreetly near the collective control. The night before Reynolds' extraction mission, Ghost sat alone in the aircraft hangar, running pre-flight checks with religious devotion. Each switch, gauge, and control surface received her personal attention. The Apache's twin General Electric T700 engines hummed softly as she powered up systems, their turbine whine creating a mechanical symphony that other pilots found overwhelming, but Ghost found comforting. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, approached with maintenance logs and a concerned expression. Santos had worked with Ghost for 2 years and understood the pilot's perfectionist tendencies, but tonight felt different. "Ma'am, the bird's ready. Systems are green across the board, but—" Santos hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "This mission feels wrong. Intel is too clean, too convenient. What if it's a trap?" Ghost's hands continued their methodical inspection, muscle memory guiding her through procedures learned through thousands of flight hours. "Every mission could be a trap, Santos. That's why we prepare for everything." Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death multiple times and emerged victorious. But beneath the professional exterior, doubt gnawed at her consciousness like a persistent ache. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against the hangar windows as Ghost completed her ritual. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or tragedy, success or failure, life or death. In combat aviation, those margins were measured in milliseconds and inches. She touched the small photograph tucked inside her helmet, her brother Dmitri in his Russian Air Force uniform, killed in Chechnya before she ever had the chance to say goodbye. As the first hints of dawn crept across Kandahar airfield, Ghost made her final preparations. The extraction mission would launch in 6 hours, carrying her into the heart of enemy territory to rescue a man whose survival seemed impossible. But impossibility was a concept she had rejected long ago, replaced by determination, skill, and an unshakable belief that every American warrior deserved to come home. The mission briefing at 800 hours revealed additional complications that made several pilots visibly uncomfortable. Intelligence reports indicated increased Taliban activity in the target region, with possible surface-to-air missile installations and coordinated ambush positions. The weather forecast predicted deteriorating conditions, with mountain winds gusting up to 40 knots and visibility dropping to near zero by late afternoon. Colonel Barnes stood before the assembled pilots, his weathered face betraying concern despite his attempt at military stoicism. "This is voluntary, people. No shame in stepping back from this one." His eyes lingered on Ghost, an unspoken invitation to reconsider. The other pilots shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of tactical reality. Ghost stepped forward without hesitation. "Sir, request permission to launch immediately. Weather window is optimal for the next 4 hours, after which conditions deteriorate rapidly." Her analysis was precise, backed by meteorological data and tactical assessment that impressed even skeptical colleagues. This wasn't reckless courage, it was calculated risk management at its finest. The flight to the target coordinates took Ghost through some of Afghanistan's most treacherous terrain. The Hindu Kush mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised turbulence and limited visibility. Her Apache hugged the mountainous terrain, using valleys and ridgelines for concealment while maintaining constant communication with forward operating bases. Ghost lead, this is Overwatch. We're tracking your position but losing satellite coverage due to atmospheric interference. You're flying blind in 20 minutes. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, the mission coordinator whose calm professionalism masked deep concern for Ghost's safety. Copy, Overwatch. Transitioning to terrain following radar and visual navigation. Ghost lead out. Her response was characteristically brief, conserving radio bandwidth while conveying complete confidence in her abilities. Inside the cockpit, however, Ghost's senses were hyper-alert, processing hundreds of environmental inputs simultaneously. The Apache's advanced avionics provided critical information, but Ghost had learned to trust her instincts above electronic systems. She could feel atmospheric pressure changes through the aircraft's control responses, detect wind shear through subtle vibrations in the airframe, and identify potential threats through visual anomalies that others might dismiss as terrain features. As she approached the target valley, Ghost noticed something that intelligence reports had missed. The crash site was too perfect, too clean. Reynolds' Blackhawk sat upright with minimal damage, its rotor blades intact and cockpit glass unbroken. In her experience, helicopter crashes in mountainous terrain produce debris fields spanning hundreds of meters. This looked more like a controlled landing than a catastrophic failure. Her tactical instincts screamed warnings as she circled the valley at maximum standoff distance. Through high-powered optics, she could see Reynolds moving inside the cockpit, apparently uninjured and attempting to signal her position. But something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire scenario. Ghost had seen enough combat to recognize when reality didn't match expectations. Overwatch, Ghost lead. Visual contact with downed aircraft and survivor. Recommend holding for additional reconnaissance. Her voice remained steady, but trained ears could detect subtle tension that indicated heightened alertness. Years of combat had taught her that survival often depended on questioning apparent good fortune. The response came immediately, filled with urgency that bordered on desperation. Ghost lead, Overwatch, time-critical extraction, weather window closing rapidly, authorize immediate rescue attempt. The pressure to act quickly was understandable, but Ghost's instincts demanded caution over expediency. She continued circling, using every sensor available to scan for hidden threats. Thermal imaging revealed no human heat signatures in the surrounding terrain, but that could mean Taliban fighters were using advanced camouflage or positioning themselves in locations that blocked thermal detection. Her experience fighting insurgents had taught her that absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. The mountains themselves seemed to whisper warnings as wind patterns shifted unexpectedly, creating dangerous downdrafts and crosswinds that challenged even her exceptional piloting skills. Ghost compensated automatically, making minute adjustments to collective and cyclic controls that kept the Apache stable despite increasingly difficult conditions. Reynolds' survival seemed miraculous until Ghost considered alternative explanations. What if the Blackhawk hadn't crashed at all? What if it had been captured intact, and Reynolds was being used as bait in an elaborate trap? The Taliban had demonstrated increasing sophistication in their tactics, and using American prisoners to lure rescue helicopters into ambushes was a proven strategy. Her brother's voice echoed in her memory, a conversation from years earlier about recognizing deception in combat situations. The enemy's greatest weapon, Dmitri had said, is not their guns or bombs, but their ability to make you see what you want to see instead of what is actually there. His words carried new weight as Ghost studied the scene below. The decision point arrived with brutal clarity. She could attempt an immediate extraction, risking her life and aircraft on what might be an elaborate trap, or she could abort the mission and potentially abandon a fellow warrior to death or capture. Neither option was acceptable, but combat demanded choices between bad and worse alternatives. Ghost keyed her radio with steady fingers. Overwatch, Ghost lead, initiating tactical reconnaissance pattern. Request immediate intelligence update on enemy positions and friendly forces in area. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to question orders through years of proven competence under fire. The radio crackled with static before Richardson's voice returned, tight with tension. Ghost lead, negative on friendly forces. Intelligence indicates minimal enemy presence, but data is 48 hours old. Your call, Major. The weight of command settled on Ghost's shoulders like a familiar burden. She had faced similar moments throughout her career, instances where training, experience, and instinct converged to create life-or-death decisions. The difference was that this time, personal history intersected with professional duty in ways that complicated rational analysis. Reynolds wasn't just another pilot. He was a connection to her brother's memory and her own unresolved grief. The Apache banked sharply as Ghost initiated a high-speed reconnaissance pass, using terrain masking to approach the crash site from an unexpected angle. Her weapons systems were armed and ready, finger poised over trigger controls that could unleash devastating firepower in milliseconds. If this was a trap, she intended to spring it on her own terms. Through the targeting system's magnified optics, she could see Reynolds more clearly. His uniform appeared intact, movement seemed natural, and his survival signals followed standard protocols. But something about his positioning struck her as rehearsed, too perfect for someone who had supposedly survived a helicopter crash in hostile territory. As Ghost completed her reconnaissance pass, she noticed tire tracks in the valley floor that intelligence photos hadn't revealed. The patterns suggested heavy vehicles had recently accessed the crash site, but Taliban forces typically used lighter, more mobile transportation. The tracks looked military, possibly Soviet-era equipment that insurgents had captured and modified. Her tactical computer began correlating multiple data sources, painting a picture that grew more concerning with each passing second. Satellite imagery showed unusual heat signatures in nearby caves, radio intercepts indicated coordinated enemy communications, and weather reports predicted a complete loss of visibility within 30 minutes. Ghost made her decision with the cold precision that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. Overwatch, Ghost lead, aborting direct extraction, initiating alternative approach. Her words carried finality that discouraged argument, backed by combat credibility that few could question. The alternative approach required skills that pushed both pilot and aircraft beyond normal operational limits. Ghost would use the deteriorating weather as concealment, approaching the crash site through a canyon system that maps indicated was too narrow for safe helicopter navigation. Success would require flying by instruments and instinct through terrain that had claimed several aircraft over the years. Her Apache descended into the canyon like a metal raptor seeking prey, rotor blades clearing rocky walls by mere feet on either side. The sound of turbine engines echoed off stone walls, creating an acoustic signature that could mask her approach from enemy listening posts. Ghost's hands moved with surgical precision, making constant corrections to maintain safe clearance. The canyon's twisting path required navigation skills that few pilots possessed. Ghost had memorized the route during mission planning, but flying it in deteriorating visibility demanded absolute trust in her instruments and spatial awareness. One miscalculation would result in catastrophic impact with unforgiving mountain stone. As she navigated the treacherous passage, Ghost's radio intercepted Taliban communications that confirmed her worst suspicions. Enemy forces were indeed using Reynolds as bait, with multiple ambush positions prepared to destroy any rescue attempt. The trap was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, involving coordinated surface-to-air missiles and heavy machine gun positions. The realization brought no satisfaction, only grim determination to extract Reynolds despite overwhelming odds. Ghost had never abandoned a fellow warrior, and she wouldn't start now. But success would require tactics that pushed beyond conventional rescue procedures into the realm of combat improvisation. Her Apache emerged from the canyon at maximum velocity, appearing in the target valley like an avenging spirit materializing from the mountains themselves. The element of surprise was total. Taliban fighters scrambled for weapons and positions. They had prepared for a conventional approach from the opposite direction. Ghost's thumb found the weapon's release trigger as her targeting system acquired multiple enemy positions simultaneously. The Apache's 30 chain gun spoke with mechanical precision, sending depleted uranium rounds into carefully camouflaged fighting positions. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition stockpiles and fuel supplies, creating chaos among insurgent forces. The rescue itself required split-second timing and absolute trust between pilot and aircraft. Ghost brought the Apache into a hover mere feet above Reynolds' position, her rotor wash creating a dust storm that provided additional concealment. Reynolds moved with practiced efficiency, securing himself to the helicopter's external rescue hoist, while enemy rounds sparked off armored hull plating. Taliban fighters attempted to coordinate their response, but Ghost's aggressive maneuvering and suppressive fire kept them disorganized and ineffective. Her Apache danced through the valley like a deadly ballet, alternating between aggressive attack runs and defensive evasion that demonstrated mastery of combat aviation at its highest level. As Reynolds was winched to safety, Ghost prepared for the most dangerous phase of the mission, extraction under fire from a confined valley with limited escape routes. Enemy forces had recovered from their initial surprise and were directing concentrated fire at her aircraft. Multiple warning lights illuminated her instrument panel as systems began failing under combat stress. The Apache clawed for altitude as Ghost pushed engines beyond their design limits, trading aircraft longevity for survival. Behind them, the valley erupted in frustrated gunfire as Taliban fighters realized their carefully planned ambush had failed. Ghost's unconventional approach had turned their tactical advantage into a deadly liability. Reynolds' voice came through the intercom system, weak but grateful. "Ghost, I don't know how you found me, but thank you." His words carried the weight of someone who had accepted death and found unexpected salvation. For Ghost, it was simply another mission completed, another warrior brought home. The flight back to Kandahar tested both aircraft and pilot as damaged systems struggled to maintain functionality. Ghost nursed her wounded Apache through mountain passes and hostile airspace, using every ounce of skill and experience to compensate for failing hydraulics and compromised flight controls. The bird that had carried her into battle was dying beneath her hands. Emergency landing procedures at Kandahar Airfield drew crowds of personnel who had heard radio traffic and understood the mission's significance. As Ghost's Apache touched down with smoke trailing from multiple systems, ground crews rushed to secure the aircraft and assist with Reynolds' medical evacuation. The successful rescue against impossible odds had already become legend. Colonel Barnes was among the first to greet Ghost as she shut down her aircraft's failing engines. His earlier skepticism had been replaced by genuine respect and admiration. "Major, that was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. How did you know it was a trap?" His question carried professional curiosity mixed with personal acknowledgement of her superior tactical judgment. Ghost removed her helmet with hands that showed no trace of tremor despite the mission's intensity. "Sir, sometimes you have to trust your instincts over intelligence reports. The enemy wants us to see what they want us to see." Her words echoed her brother's wisdom, now validated through successful combat application. The debriefing session revealed the full scope of Taliban preparations for what they had assumed would be a conventional rescue attempt. Intelligence analysts were amazed by the sophistication of the ambush and the narrow margin by which disaster had been avoided. Ghost's unconventional approach had not only saved Reynolds' life, but prevented a propaganda victory that would have encouraged further attacks on American aircraft. As word of the rescue spread throughout the base, Ghost noticed a subtle but significant change in how other pilots regarded her. The skeptical glances and whispered doubts were replaced by respectful nods and genuine camaraderie. She had proven herself not through politics or favoritism, but through skill, courage, and results that spoke louder than any words. Reynolds' recovery was swift, his physical injuries minor compared to the psychological impact of 3 days in Taliban captivity. During his debriefing, he described how insurgent forces had used sophisticated psychological warfare, trying to break his will by describing how female pilots were considered weak links in American military operations. Ghost's rescue had proven those tactics spectacularly wrong. The damaged Apache underwent extensive repairs, but Ghost had already requested assignment to another aircraft. In her experience, helicopters that had been pushed beyond their limits often developed subtle handling characteristics that could prove dangerous in future combat situations. Better to transition to a fresh bird than risk mission failure due to compromised equipment. Her new Apache, tail number 60521, arrived 3 weeks later with upgraded systems and enhanced defensive capabilities. Ghost spent days familiarizing herself with its unique characteristics, building the intimate relationship between pilot and machine that was essential for combat effectiveness. Each aircraft had its own personality, and successful pilots learned to work with rather than against these individual traits. The success of Reynolds' rescue mission led to additional high-risk assignments that challenged Ghost's skills in new ways. Intelligence officers began specifically requesting her for missions that other pilots considered impossible or suicidal. Her reputation for bringing people home against overwhelming odds made her the go-to pilot for desperate situations. One such mission involved extracting a Navy SEAL team that had been compromised during a reconnaissance operation in Pakistan's tribal regions. The SEALs were surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces and running low on ammunition, with conventional rescue attempts blocked by heavy anti-aircraft defenses and mountainous terrain that limited approach options. Ghost studied the tactical situation with her characteristic thoroughness, identifying weaknesses in enemy positions that others had missed. The key was timing, attacking during a brief window when weather conditions would provide concealment while maintaining sufficient visibility for precision flying. Success would require split-second coordination between multiple aircraft and ground forces. The mission launched at midnight under a moonless sky, with Ghost leading a formation of 3 Apache helicopters through terrain that challenged even her exceptional navigation skills. Radio silence was mandatory to avoid detection, leaving each pilot dependent on visual reference points and predetermined navigation waypoints. As they approached the target area, Taliban forces lit signal fires that illuminated potential helicopter landing zones, a clear indication that the enemy was prepared for rescue attempts and had positioned forces accordingly. Ghost recognized the tactical situation immediately and began implementing counter-ambush procedures that her fellow pilots had never seen before. Instead of avoiding the illuminated zones, Ghost led her formation directly toward them at maximum speed, using the enemy's own preparations against them. Taliban fighters positioned to ambush helicopters in the illuminated areas found themselves under attack from directions they hadn't anticipated. Their carefully planned defensive positions turned into death traps. The SEAL extraction required precision flying in conditions that pushed human and mechanical limits. Ghost's Apache hovered in a narrow canyon, while team members rappelled to safety, enemy fire ricocheting off rocky walls and creating sparks that threatened to ignite fuel vapors. Her steady hands and calm voice over the radio provided reassurance to SEALs who were fighting for their lives. As the last SEAL reached safety, Ghost's aircraft took multiple hits from a heavy machine gun that had remained hidden throughout the firefight. Hydraulic fluid streamed from damaged lines, and warning alarms filled the cockpit with urgent sounds that indicated critical system failures. The Apache was dying, but the mission wasn't complete until everyone was safe. Her emergency landing at a forward operating base pushed the Apache beyond its design limits, but Ghost's skill and the aircraft's rugged construction combined to deliver the SEALs to safety. Ground crews worked frantically to shut down systems and prevent fires as Ghost completed her shutdown procedures with mechanical precision, despite obvious equipment failures. The SEAL team leader, a grizzled master chief with 20 years of special operations experience, approached Ghost with an expression of genuine gratitude and professional respect. "Ma'am, I've been extracted by a lot of pilots over the years, but that was something special. You didn't just save our lives, you made it look easy." His words carried weight that transcended military rank or gender distinctions. Word of Ghost's exploits began reaching higher command levels, attracting attention from senior officers who recognized exceptional combat leadership. Her tactics were studied and incorporated into training programs. Her mission reports became required reading for combat aviation students, and her call sign became synonymous with successful rescue operations under impossible conditions. But recognition came with increased scrutiny and expectations that tested Ghost's psychological resilience as much as her flying skills. Every mission was now evaluated not just for success or failure, but for adherence to the impossibly high standards that her previous accomplishments had established. The pressure to maintain perfection was enormous and unrelenting. The psychological toll of constant combat operations began manifesting in subtle ways that Ghost recognized but couldn't entirely control. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by dreams of falling aircraft and failed rescue attempts. Her hands developed a slight tremor that only appeared during quiet moments when adrenaline levels dropped to normal ranges. Santos, her crew chief, noticed the changes first and approached the subject with the delicate care of someone who understood combat stress but respected professional boundaries. "Ma'am, maybe it's time to consider rotation back to the States. You've done more than your share over here." Her suggestion was motivated by genuine concern rather than questions about Ghost's competence. Ghost's response was predictable but troubling. She requested extension of her deployment, citing operational requirements and her unique skills in high-risk rescue operations. Command approved the extension despite growing concerns about pilot fatigue and psychological stress among their most valuable combat assets. The decision to remain in theater led to Ghost's most significant mission yet, one that would define her legacy and change military aviation doctrine forever. Intelligence reported that a cargo aircraft carrying humanitarian supplies had crashed in the Afghan-Pakistan border region, with survivors scattered across multiple locations and enemy forces closing in rapidly. The survivors included civilian aid workers, military personnel, and Afghan interpreters, whose lives would be forfeit if captured by Taliban forces. Traditional rescue protocols called for multiple aircraft and extensive planning, but weather conditions and enemy activity required immediate action to prevent a humanitarian disaster. Ghost volunteered for what military planners considered a suicide mission, single aircraft insertion into hostile territory, to extract survivors from multiple locations before enemy forces could organize effective resistance. The tactical situation was impossible by conventional standards, but Ghost had built her reputation by succeeding where others failed. Her final mission briefing took place in a bunker deep beneath Kandahar airfield, attended by senior officers who understood they were potentially sending one of their finest pilots to her death. The assembled commanders had exhausted conventional options and were reluctantly turning to their most unconventional asset for a solution that textbooks said couldn't exist. Ghost studied the intelligence reports with the same meticulous attention she had applied to hundreds of previous missions, but this time the odds were stacked beyond rational calculation. Multiple extraction points across 50 miles of hostile territory, deteriorating weather, and enemy forces that outnumbered friendly assets by margins that made success appear mathematically impossible. As she prepared for what might be her final flight, Ghost reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a Russian immigrant girl who dreamed of flying to a combat veteran whose skills had saved dozens of lives, her path had been defined by the determination to prove that courage and competence transcended gender, nationality, or conventional expectations. The pre-flight ritual took on special significance as Ghost prepared her Apache for the mission that would either crown her career or end it in the mountains of Afghanistan. Every switch, gauge, and control surface received her personal attention, as if she were preparing not just an aircraft, but a testament to everything she believed about duty, honor, and the warrior's code. Her hands moved through familiar procedures with the unconscious precision of thousands of flight hours, but her mind was already projecting forward to the tactical challenges that awaited. Success would require pushing beyond every limit she had previously encountered, demanding reserves of skill and determination that she wasn't certain she possessed. As Ghost taxied her Apache toward the runway, the weight of expectation pressed down like the mountain air itself, thin, demanding, and unforgiving of mistakes. Behind her, the lights of Kandahar airfield represented safety, support, and the possibility of living to fight another day. Ahead lay darkness, uncertainty, and the ultimate test of everything she had learned about combat aviation. The takeoff was smooth despite her aircraft's heavy fuel load and maximum ammunition configuration. Ghost had requested every advantage possible for the mission, knowing that return trips would be impossible and resupply unlikely. This would be a single-shot attempt to achieve what conventional military wisdom declared impossible. As her Apache climbed into the Afghan night, Ghost keyed her radio for what might be her final transmission from Kandahar airfield. Tower, Ghost lead departing to the north. Request weather updates on tactical frequency. Her voice carried the same calm professionalism that had characterized thousands of previous flights, betraying none of the uncertainty that gnawed at her confidence. The response came immediately, tinged with emotion that professional protocols couldn't entirely suppress. Ghost lead tower, whether holding for next 4 hours, deteriorating rapidly after that. Good hunting, Major. The controller's words carried unspoken messages of respect, gratitude, and the fervent hope that this wouldn't be their final conversation. Ghost's Apache disappeared into the darkness, carrying with it the hopes of crash survivors scattered across hostile territory, and the prayers of everyone who understood the magnitude of what she was attempting. The sky that had been her domain for so many years now beckoned with both promise and threat, offering either glory or grave as the final measure of her courage. The first extraction point lay 90 minutes flight time through some of Afghanistan's most dangerous airspace, where Taliban forces had positioned sophisticated air defense systems, specifically designed to target American helicopters. Ghost's route would take her through valleys where other aircraft had fallen, over ridgelines that concealed enemy observers, and into landing zones that existed only in the fevered imagination of mission planners desperate for any option. As the kilometers passed beneath her rotor disc, Ghost found herself thinking not of death or failure, but of the promise she had made to never leave a warrior behind. Every person waiting for rescue represented that commitment made manifest, a sacred obligation that transcended personal fear or rational calculation of risk versus reward. The radio crackled with position reports from other aircraft operating in the region, their pilots providing what support they could without compromising their own missions. Ghost acknowledged each transmission with professional courtesy, but her focus remained fixed on the task ahead and the skills that would determine whether this night ended in triumph or tragedy. The mountains of Afghanistan rose around her like ancient sentinels guarding secrets that had claimed empires and broken armies throughout history. But Ghost had learned to read their moods, understand their dangers, and use their concealment to her advantage. Tonight, they would either shelter her mission or become the tomb of her ambitions. As she approached the first extraction point, Ghost could see fires burning in the valley below, some marking crash sites, others indicating enemy positions. The tactical picture was complex and fluid, requiring split-second decisions based on incomplete information and instincts honed through years of combat experience. Her targeting system identified multiple heat signatures scattered across the crash site, but distinguishing between survivors and enemy forces would require visual confirmation at ranges that exposed her to ground fire. Ghost began her approach with weapons systems armed and finger poised over triggers that could unleash devastating firepower in milliseconds. The first survivors were exactly where intelligence had predicted, three aid workers huddled behind the wreckage of their transport aircraft, wounded but mobile enough to reach her helicopter if given the opportunity. Ghost's approach was textbook perfect, using terrain masking to avoid enemy observation until the final seconds before landing. As her Apache touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, the survivors ran toward her aircraft with the desperate energy of people who had accepted death and found unexpected salvation. Ghost kept her engines at flight idle, ready to lift off immediately if enemy forces appeared, or if the tactical situation deteriorated beyond acceptable risk levels. The loading process took 43 seconds, an eternity in combat aviation, where survival often depended on minimizing exposure time. Ghost's crew chief provided covering fire while civilians scrambled aboard, their faces reflecting the shock and relief of people snatched from the jaws of catastrophe by what seemed like divine intervention. Ghost lead, package secure, departing primary extraction point. Her radio transmission was characteristically brief, conserving bandwidth while reporting mission progress to commanders who were following every development with intense interest. Success at the first location provided hope that the impossible might actually be achievable. The flight to the second extraction point required navigation through a canyon system that military maps indicated was too narrow for safe helicopter passage. But Ghost had studied the terrain exhaustively and identified a route that would provide concealment while allowing enough maneuvering room for her Apache's 48-foot rotor disc. The canyon walls pressed close on either side as Ghost threaded her aircraft through passages that seemed designed to trap unwary pilots. Her instruments indicated safe clearance margins, but visual references suggested otherwise, as stone surfaces reflected rotor wash and engine heat back into the cockpit in waves that made concentration difficult. Emerging from the canyon at maximum velocity, Ghost found herself in a valley where a military transport had scattered its human cargo across several hundred meters of rocky terrain. Survivors were visible from altitude, but so were enemy forces moving to intercept them before rescue could arrive. The tactical situation required aggressive action to prevent massacre of helpless civilians and military personnel. Ghost's Apache became an angel of destruction, raining precision fire on Taliban positions while survivors gathered at predetermined rally points. Her weapon systems cycled through targets with mechanical efficiency, each trigger pull eliminating threats that could compromise the rescue operation. The second extraction was more complicated than the first, requiring multiple landings to collect survivors from positions that her helicopter couldn't reach simultaneously. Each landing exposed Ghost to additional risk as enemy forces adapted their tactics and concentrated fire on her aircraft. By the time she lifted off with the second group of survivors, Ghost's Apache had sustained multiple hits from small arms fire and at least one rocket-propelled grenade that had detonated close enough to damage secondary systems. Warning lights illuminated her instrument panel like a Christmas tree, indicating failures that would normally ground the aircraft immediately. But normal procedures didn't apply to missions where failure meant death for people who were depending on her skills and determination. Ghost compensated for failing systems through flying techniques that pushed both pilot and aircraft beyond their designed limits, trading long-term survivability for short-term mission success. The third and final extraction point presented the greatest challenge yet. Survivors scattered across an area controlled by a Taliban unit that had been specifically trained in anti-aircraft tactics. Intelligence reports indicated the presence of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles and coordinated machine gun positions that could create interlocking fields of fire. Ghost's approach required every ounce of skill and experience she had accumulated through years of combat operations. She used terrain features for concealment, flew at altitudes that minimized exposure time, and employed evasive maneuvers that kept enemy gunners from establishing stable firing solutions. The final survivors included two badly wounded soldiers who couldn't move without assistance, and an Afghan interpreter, whose knowledge of local Taliban networks made his capture a strategic disaster waiting to happen. Ghost's crew chief rappelled to the ground to assist with casualty evacuation, while she provided covering fire that kept enemy forces at bay. As the last survivor was loaded aboard her Apache, Ghost realized that her aircraft had reached the absolute limit of its carrying capacity. The combination of fuel, ammunition, and human cargo exceeded maximum gross weight specifications by margins that made normal flight operations impossible. The takeoff from the final extraction point required flight techniques that existed only in theory and emergency procedures that had never been tested under actual combat conditions. Ghost's Apache clawed for altitude with agonizing slowness, every foot of climb representing a victory over physics, enemy fire, and mechanical limitations. Enemy forces concentrated their fire on her overloaded aircraft as it struggled to gain altitude and airspeed. Multiple systems failed under the combined stress of combat damage and excessive operational demands, but Ghost's hands remained steady on the controls as she nursed her dying Apache toward the safety of friendly airspace. The flight back to Kandahar airfield became an exercise in aviation survival that tested every skill Ghost had learned throughout her career. She compensated for failing hydraulics with muscle strength, overcame instrument failures with visual navigation, and maintained flight control through sheer determination and professional competence. Radio calls from other aircraft offered assistance, but Ghost's situation was beyond what conventional rescue procedures could address. She was flying a critically damaged helicopter, carrying maximum human cargo through hostile airspace, with systems failing in cascade patterns that threatened catastrophic loss of control. Her final transmission to Kandahar Tower carried the weight of someone who had pushed beyond every limit and achieved the impossible through skill, courage, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. Tower, Ghost lead inbound with multiple passengers, declaring emergency. Request immediate medical response and crash equipment standing by. The landing at Kandahar airfield became the stuff of legend. A critically damaged Apache helicopter delivering 23 survivors to safety.